Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you for the very kind invitation. I'm glad to be here. It's my first time in Slovakia, and it's been a brilliant 13 hours or so. I have been asked to come and talk to you about district heating and the European Union's energy policy. Before I do that, just 2 words about who we are. So my organization is first and foremost a district heating lobby at the level of the European Union. And we have 3 basic jobs. First, to speak on behalf of the industry to the institutions in Brussels. Second, to try and explain to the industry what's happening in Brussels and why it matters to us. And third, to serve as a kind of forum to bring the industry together, including cooperation in events like this. Now, I am aware that that's not a Slovakian flag. A short story for you. In my first weeks when I started this job, a little more than 3 years ago, there was one of these periodic crises that we get with gas supply from Russia. And suddenly the European Union and the European Commission in particular were very concerned about supply security and wanted to organize a big event. And I was new into this job and thought, what a perfect opportunity to underline the importance of district heating and locally supplied heat solutions. So the conference came and there was only one problem: they didn't invite us. So I made some phone calls and begged a few friends and eventually got myself a place in the room, got to this big conference center and noticed that while the other people around the table had name tags and spaces for them, there was nothing for us. So the only empty seat I could find belonged to the Croatian government, who had not showed up to the conference. So I thought, okay, well that's a problem solved, I'll sit here. And I waited for my opportunity. And at a certain point I raised my hand, looking at the Commission official across the table, expecting him to recognize me and introduce us as the district heating sector. Instead he said, Croatia would like to take the floor. And I felt a little bit discouraged. And I left the room thinking, if nobody's thinking about district heating, how are we going to make our point? How are we going to tell our story? And I left the room determined to make sure that nothing like that would happen to us again. And 3 years later, I think we're in somewhat better shape. Now, talking about European energy policy, well, what is this policy anyway? The story is pretty simple. It's about how to solve 3 problems at the same time. First, deal with the question of climate and CO2. Second, and at the same time, make sure that we have supply security, make sure that we can get access to the energy that our economy needs. And third, to do both of those things without compromising the economic development of Europe and its society and its people. And everything that has gone on in the last 10 years or so, as Europe has started to try and build an energy policy, has basically been aimed at solving that equation, balancing those 3 objectives. I think you know the general story. A first generation of targets on renewable energy, on CO2 reduction, and energy efficiency, starting in 2007, goals for 2020, and we have goals for 2030, but frankly it's not very interesting, it's just kind of incremental change along the same lines. Something more fundamental, 2050. Now, these are actually old ideas and old goals set some years ago. 80 to 95% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050. Following the Paris Climate Agreement last year, it has been widely agreed that actually even this is not enough. And I think that before the end of 2017, or at the very least next year, there will be serious discussions at European level about a 100% greenhouse gas reduction target for 2050. And if you're in the heat business or the buildings business, that's very serious business indeed. Because if you look at that, and if you imagine a 100% target, no more emissions from buildings. So we need solutions for heating our buildings without generating CO2 emissions. And when I started my career in Brussels, a little more than 10 years ago, we used to talk about 2050, but frankly it sounded like science fiction. And today, in infrastructure and planning terms, it sounds like tomorrow. So this is not science fiction anymore, this is our planning horizon. I did have a reason for that. There's one more story. Not so long ago, my wife and my small son were out shopping in town, walking around, and suddenly my boy is going, "Mommy, look, look, look," pointing at this enormous picture, this picture on the wall, and he's very excited, and my wife is surprised because he's 5 years old, and confused, and just about to start a lecture on the depiction of women in the media and everything that's wrong with it and so on, and she says to him, "Why do you like this picture anyway?" You know what he said? "Swimming pool." Nice. And I heard this story, and of course I laughed, and I started thinking about the way that we see what's important to us when we look at something. And everybody can see something different in the picture. When we talk about energy in Brussels, we so often talk exclusively about electricity. That has been the traditional way of doing things. When the European Commission published its first papers on the 2030 targets, I counted 25 references to electricity and not one single word about heat. Nothing. But I don't think I need to explain to you that actually, if you look at the breakdown of the way we use energy, there's nothing more important than heat. Nothing. Actually, electricity is a kind of sideshow, but it has completely dominated the debate traditionally. Yeah, so my Slovakian is not... Now, what's wrong with that? Well, actually, you already know, because you have a very similar picture here. This comes from down the street from my office in Brussels. It's a nice street, nice buildings, no problem. Every single building is burning oil or gas. Lots of oil, actually, downstairs. So I see no point in talking about plans for full decarbonization of the energy system and blah, 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 while everybody has a boiler downstairs and nobody's doing anything about it. And that's the current situation. Now, if we go back to 2014, the EU's heating and cooling policy looked more or less like that. And if I'm really generous, I might say they had a few ideas. First, they would really like to tell people just to dress more warmly. Second, we can do everything with electricity, which the technicians here will know causes certain problems of its own. And finally, why don't we just stop needing heat? Why don't we have really energy-efficient buildings so that we don't need to heat them anymore? I don't know the Slovakian word for bullshit, but this is a very dangerous way of thinking about things. Of course, we will need to heat our buildings. No more heat in 2050? This is a magazine explaining that soon everyone's going to have their own flying helicopter. This is from 1953. Nuclear-powered vacuum cleaners, a reality in every home by 2070. And maybe, yeah, I mean, maybe. But I think Bratislava might look something like this in 2050, and frankly, I hope so. He can wait. So the point is, we will need to heat and cool our buildings in 2050, and we will need to do so in a way that is consistent with the other objectives that the European Union has set, because they are important. Whether you care about the climate, whether you care about energy security, whether you care about the economy, or whether you care about all of them, we will need to solve this problem. And as things stand today, we do have a problem in Europe. Now, that's me complaining. And my first 2-3 years on the job, all I did was go to the European Commission and complain. Why do you have no heat policy? Why do you have no heat strategy? Why do you have no plan? My dog has epilepsy. And every morning I need to give the dog his medicine. And every morning we go through this same piece of theater where he spits it out and I put it back and he spits it out. It takes me 5 minutes every single morning. And with the greatest respect to my friends and colleagues at the European Commission, the process of talking to them about heat and the importance of heat reminded me a little bit of this song and dance I go through with my dog. Around 2014, end of 2014, beginning of 2015, they somehow began to swallow the medicine and we saw some change. Now, it wasn't just us, we had some help. More problems with gas supply, more anxiety, and more recognition that actually an energy supply crisis is basically a heat supply crisis more than anything else. And this guy, now normally I have to explain who this is when I'm outside of Brussels, but I think here he's known. So a new commissioner, this concept of an energy union, and suddenly some space for some new ideas. So you're aware of the energy union concept that he launched. Now frankly, a lot of that is kind of a continuation of things which had already started, but there was an important new element. This is a leaked copy of the energy union strategy that was circulating in Brussels in the weeks before they published it, and you see the sophisticated work that goes on. So we saw this as evidence that we were starting to be heard. And more evidence. In 2015, in February, the European Commission organized a really big conference. I think we had 700 people talking about the future of heating and cooling in Europe. So things were starting to move. They even let me talk. And later that year, we got the first ever European heating and cooling strategy. And it makes a few basic points. One of which is that heating and cooling is not going anywhere as a demand. We will still be heating and cooling in 2050. So we can start with that. Second, that the current reliance on oil and gas individual boilers is not a long-term solution. Third, that there are ways to shift to renewable heat and to waste heat. And fourth, that district heating is going to have an important role to play in all that. Then we see this. This is a European Commission slide which was being used last year. New areas, including district heating and cooling. It's amazing when you tell Danish people that that's a new area, or Slovakian people for that matter. Cogeneration, thermal storage, waste heat and waste cold. These ideas which are old news to us, but which have become fresh and important and exciting in Brussels over the last year or two. Now that's a kind of rhetorical level. That's talking about things in principle, and from there we need to get on to the process of translating that into legislation. And that's what's happening now. We are in the middle of dealing with something called the Clean Energy Package. It is an enormous package of legislative measures, the most important of which, for us, is a new directive on renewable energy. And we are right now negotiating this, or it is being negotiated in Brussels, and we are doing our best to provide input to the process. In order to save time, I won't dwell on all the detail, but one important issue which has come up right now is there is a discussion about whether or not there should be legally obligated third-party access to district heating networks. Now, I guess to a Slovakian audience this is already a familiar concept. I think that, as the previous speaker said, we need to be open to making sure, ways to make sure that consumers have a good experience. But we have serious doubts as to whether or not this, as proposed by the Commission, is the most appropriate way of achieving that goal. But we are in discussions now, and I'm optimistic that the final result will be a text which supports the development of district heating without putting up unnecessary obstacles to its development. Now, the important point that I'd like to make here, it's my job to defend the interests of the district heating sector, but we also have to decide what kind of a sector we want to be and how we want to be seen. And basically, if you ask people about district heating, there are two conflicting visions of what it is. Here's the first, on the right. The way I used to think about district heating before I knew anything about it. Old technology, cold, inefficient, wasteful, generally disappointing to the user. And there are still people who think that way about district heating. On the right, you see a much more forward-looking, optimistic, hopeful version of what the sector can be. And I'll leave it to Henrik to talk you through the details in a few minutes. But this sector can be so much more than some coal and some old pipes, as you know. This is the story which I'll let Henrik tell you about the change. What I love about this sector, it is defined by constant evolution. We're not talking about an energy source, we're just talking about a thoughtful way of getting energy from where it is to where it's needed. And district heating can grow and change with the energy system around it. Now, a few concluding thoughts. The first is, for the first time, the European Union is, I think, genuinely excited about the heating and cooling sector and about district heating. And this creates opportunities. There will be more support, financial support, but also regulatory support. I find that when we go to the institutions to talk about things that the sector needs, they are much, much more receptive than they were a few years ago because they have understood that it's important. However, this enthusiasm for district heating, this love for district heating, it's not unconditional. It depends on us, our willingness to change. We cannot ask people to love district heating because it's district heating. We have to be the best version of ourselves. That means thinking about how to integrate more sustainable resources. That means thinking about how to give our customers a better experience so that they want to stay with us. So that they don't think that a step forward would be to move from district heating to one of these oil or gas boilers that I think we need to be phasing out. But that's partly on us. It's not just enough for us to ask for things. We have to be ready to change and grow and develop. Now next, what we do in Brussels is only the start, it's not enough. You know this business is inherently local. So we can set a framework at the level of the EU, and that's what they're doing, but ultimately, practical decisions are going to need to be made here on the ground. And I have just a few suggestions based on what I have seen to work well in other countries. First, have a plan. Have a long-term plan for your heating sector. How do you want to see it develop? What's the long-term strategy? It gives your stakeholders confidence and vision to invest. Second, let local authorities play an important role. You cannot do this without cities. And I find that in our industry, we're often talking about cities and maybe not talking enough to them. Third, try and find a way of establishing a CO2 price for the whole heating sector. In the country where I live, Belgium, for example, if you want district heating, you will pay a kind of de facto CO2 tax under the ETS system. There is no tax on CO2 from individual oil and gas boilers, and it creates a serious distortion in the market. Fourth, I know there is a tendency to want to regulate prices. It's a political problem if people's heat prices get too high, I know this. But my experience is that this causes another type of problem, where basically the operator loses the incentive to invest and to improve the performance of the network, which creates a negative spiral where the customer is then disappointed and complaining and unwilling to pay more. The operator has even less income and is unable or unwilling to invest, and so on. I think that what is better is to give the operator the opportunity to deliver a service that delights his customer, that keeps them happy and keeps them wanting to stay. And finally, just a word about Slovakia and what I can see here. I'm sure that the sector, the whole energy sector here is going through profound change, it was said by previous speakers. So everything is being reimagined and reinvented right now, and it's an exciting time. But it's easy to make mistakes. And if there's one mistake I would urge you not to make in this country, it's not to overlook the value of this thing that you already have in the form of existing district heating infrastructure. Because if you pull that out in order to replace it with gas boilers, which might look modern today, in 20 years I promise you, you'll be wondering how on earth you're going to do to get the district heating back. It's so much more than a way of getting some residual heat from coal. It's so much more than that. It is a wonderful asset. And of course, like in lots of other countries, you'll want to modernize and improve and change it, but leave it there, develop it. We have this expression in English, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I believe you have something similar in Slovakia. This is a crucial time in your energy development. Embrace district heating, use it for what it is, make the best of it, and I promise you the whole transition will be easier as a result. Thank you very much, I've enjoyed it.